Hello, everybody. This is Dean Smith from the Community of Human and Organizational Learning, and I am doing a very slow intro while I let everybody in from the waiting room. And it looks like we have everybody in. So welcome to our, almost everybody in. I'll be hitting buttons for a few minutes, but welcome to our October webinar. And thanks everybody for taking the time to join us today. And also just thrilled to have Dr. Martha Acosta with us, who, Martha, you're an internationally known expert in the field of safety leadership. And we just talked a little bit about your role with the Harvard Business School and leading and moderating courses, so your perspectives on safety leadership and how to ingrain things in organizations I'm just paraphrasing there, I think is amazing, and I think is going to help us really walk through a great discussion on how to bring the right context for safety to organizations. So that was just a long road to a small house on my part, but to a big house on your part. So Martha, thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you so much, Dean. I appreciate that. Well, welcome everybody. What I want to talk about today is maybe an experience that we've all had, is that frustration and trying to figure out how do we get the behavior.
So I have tried to, there was some background noise, and Martha, I'm sorry, I think I muted everybody including you, so I apologize for that.
That's okay. All right, I found my unmute button.
Thank you.
So let me start again. So what I'm going to be talking about today is an experience that many of us have had, a frustration that many of us have had in trying to drive the kind of safety behaviors that we want when our tools of authority and trying to make the work very deliberate, or punishment or discipline, let's put it that way, hasn't worked in the past. My Dean mentioned that I work with Harvard Business School's corporate learning arm now, but I started my HOP journey nearly 20 years ago at Los Alamos National Laboratory. I was working with Todd Conklin when our facility, our whole laboratory, got shut down by Congress due to safety incidents. And our lab director at the time was Vice Admiral Pete Nanos. And man, was he pissed. So he pulled everybody together into an all hands meeting, called the scientists and technicians at the laboratory cowboys and butt heads, and threatened to fire anybody who couldn't follow a procedure. And that, of course, created a lot of fear in the organization. And it created actually a huge hurdle that Todd, myself, and others had to do to try and create a new safety program and step up the laboratory based on, the robustness of that program. We didn't get the information that we needed. People weren't willing to admit where there were error-prone situations, where they needed help. It was very difficult to get people to open up and talk about what was going on after that atmosphere of fear had been created. So one thing that I want you to remember out of today is that what we ultimately manage when we are trying to influence behavior in an organization is what we're doing is we're managing meaning. People do things because it's meaningful, whether it's conscious or not. An organization is a system of meaning. It's not a set of processes and procedures, although those can be meaningful. It's not brick and mortar. It's not, even necessarily, people's, the org chart or people's roles, although those things can be meaningful. We ultimately need to be thinking about how we create the context that's going to drive the behavior that we want by thinking about what's meaningful in the organization. So I'm going to focus on 3 of the hot principles that come from Todd Conklin. And the first one that I'll talk about is how context drives behavior. And I'm going to start with a quiz. I have my chat open, so I'm going to ask you guys to also have your chat open. And I just want you to chat in yes or no for each of these statements. And I want you to think about something very specific. So, maybe think about a team that you are particularly focused on in your safety work. Maybe it's your own team if you're leading a team. Try and be as specific as possible. Identify the people and the personalities in that team. Think a moment about the work that they do and why it's important. And have that in your mind as I ask you these questions. Okay, so the first one is, in thinking about the team, is this statement true or false? Or you can say yes or no. When someone makes a mistake, it is often held against them. So true or false, yes or no. Okay, so we have some truths, we have some no's. All right, good. Let's go to let me give people a little bit of more of a chance to answer. All right, let's go to the next one. Newcomers must conform to be accepted, and new ideas and different perspectives are rarely given much credence. Okay, I'm seeing a lot more truths in this case. I like the no ways. That's good. And it depends. Yeah, and I think it depends is a perfectly reasonable answer here. But what we're thinking about, yeah, it shouldn't be true, Chrissy, but we want to first understand we can't change until we know where we are. What dynamics are really happening here, and help us look at those dynamics and see what might be meaningful. So somehow working from how it should be or how it shouldn't be isn't as helpful when we're actually trying to drive change. We need to be open and willing to accept where we are at the moment. Okay, the next one is, even though there is an open door policy, the manager rarely hears about difficult issues or problems. Is this true or false for you in this team that you're thinking about? Okay, so we have some truths, we have some sometimes, we have some, all right, some falses, good. All right, Jim, I'm sort of using you as my, the person that I know now everybody's done. Okay, oh, well, and then everybody comes out. All right, yeah, not applicable in the team that you're thinking of. Okay, and this really, we're talking about team dynamics. We really have to recognize that when we're thinking about group dynamics, we have to choose a group. We have subcultures and microcultures within larger organizations. We have a larger organization. One of the frustrations that the senior executives that I work with have is that they have a very clear idea of what the culture of the organization is, and then they look at what's happening, or they learn about what's happening within one particular team or one particular function, and it doesn't jive with their understanding of the larger culture of the organization, and they don't understand what that is. They get very frustrated with that, but it's because we have all of these different microcultures within our organizations. And then people who figure it out for themselves are lauded, and asking for help is considered a weakness. All right, this is the last one. Okay, so falses, lots of no's on this one. So definitely seeing more people who are experiencing kind of a willingness to help within their organizations. Good. Well, all of these things are are things that Amy Edmondson saw as indicators of psychological safety within teams. But if you note from your own answers that not all of these things are necessarily present all the time, some of these areas are very strong in psychological safety, but others might not be. So it's not that you have to have all of these things to have psychological safety, or that if you have one of these things that you fully have psychological safety. Because what psychological safety is a team dynamic where a group of people have a shared belief that it is safe to take interpersonal risks. And what I mean by interpersonal risks and how we align this with what we've just been talking about is that you don't have a fear of blame. So an interpersonal risk is talking about your mistakes and taking a calculated risk, doing something new, or engaging in something that could lead to failure. And the lack of psychological safety is that presence of the fear of blame. What Amy Edmondson says is that our baseline is a lack of psychological safety that we always have in our groups and teams, especially when we get together, an underlying fear of blame, an underlying fear of rejection, an underlying fear of being judged, or feeling like you'll make it sound, people will judge you as stupid, or an underlying fear of conflict. We go into every social situation until we have developed a kind of dynamic with other people where we can assume that this is a safe place for us to take these interpersonal risks. Because what we're seeing is people being vulnerable about their mistakes. We're seeing that people who are different still have an ability to speak up, and their differences are valued. Because what we're seeing is that somebody asks for help and somebody is willing to help them, and asking for help isn't shameful, and offering to help somebody isn't essentially taking away that other person's dignity or face. And then what we're seeing is open conversations where people are actually arguing with each other and talking about difficult things, and they don't actually hate each other. So this is what we go into. This is the context that we should assume, that there is this fear. And of course, this fear is going to create problems for us in safety. So let me ask you guys, and you can type it into chat. If there is a fear of blame, a fear of rejection, a fear of being judged, or a fear of conflict, in what ways might that keep you from being able to identify emerging hazards, from being able to come up with robust controls, from being able to find error-prone situations, from being able to identify where the organization has weaknesses or incentives or disincentives to safety? How might our lack of psychological safety be the problem for a safety professional or safety leader? Yeah. So people tend to shut down and they don't speak up. You can't fix what you can't know, right? A lack of reporting and conversation. Yeah. So with a lack of cooperation, with a lack of information, you can't fix things. You're not necessarily in the field all the time, depending on, I was working in a facility. We had this assumption that in a facility, things didn't change, but they do. But you certainly, if you have folks working in the field, can't make the assumption that things aren't going to change. And you need people to be able to go and say, we're doing this operation in this environment in which we've never done this operation before. And here are all of the things that I'm confused about, that I'm afraid of. here are some ways that I've noticed myself making some mistakes, and I really wish that I hadn't made it. If we're not able to have that sort of open conversation, then we're not able to create the controls and hazard mitigation that we need. Now, the real problem with fear is that it drives a certain kind of behavior. It drives a certain kind of meaning at an organizational level. So Robin Ely is another Harvard professor that I have the privilege of working with, and she actually works in gender stereotypes. She doesn't really know anything or care about safety at all. But several years ago, she was writing a case study for Harvard Business School looking at a oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico. And what she was really looking for was stereotypical macho behavior, and she was going to study that. But she had started out looking at that site, and what she saw was the first column there, the defensive ego. A quote that she has in her case from a deck operator is, the guy that was in charge was the one who could basically outperform, outshoot, out-intimidate all of the others. If you didn't posture yourself in a position of power, then you set yourself up for ridicule. So her understanding of this, and her understanding of when we fall into gender stereotypes, is we fall into gender stereotypes as a type of protection of our ego. It arises out of fear. And we create these environments that become, in a stereotypically masculine culture, right? That where there's a lot of competition. Actually, I think it probably works in other sort of stereotypical gendered cultures where there is this competition to out masculinize or out feminize or whatever it might be each other. But it comes out of fear. When we defend our egos, it's because we're afraid. She went back to that platform after this organization, and I don't know what the organization is. She couldn't disclose it to me, but I worked with a lot of oil and gas, and I have a feeling I know who it is given the time frame. They went through a major culture change initiative based on safety. They implemented a huge human performance type safety change, the same thing that we did at the laboratory to stand it up. And when she came back, she saw a completely different organization, and she was actually shocked. So in interviewing a mechanic, one of her quotes was, when we need to get to the root cause of a problem or to troubleshoot something, we talk freely to each other rather than worrying about what he thinks of me. And so how she categorized this was moving from an organization where the fear drove defense of ego and therefore stereotypical masculine behavior to the culture drove a sense, what was meaningful was driving towards the well-being of all. And therefore it even in people who identified as very masculine, that was overridden. Their sense of how they present themselves was overridden by the importance of the well-being of all. And what she reported in that case, which was sort of early 2000s, was that this change had a big result for the organization. So this is one of the ways that we as safety professionals who aren't necessarily inside the dynamics of every team can start thinking about, how do we overcome that survival instinct of the prioritizing the protection of ego as a way of dealing with the underlying fear in the organization, to prioritizing the well-being of all as a way of dealing with difficult situations or, the hazards that are inherent in our work. So, and I'm seeing some things here. Yeah, being upfront is helpful. I'm just catching some of your things. Yeah, great. Okay, good. So we're all on the same page here. So this is what I want us now to look at. Think about how the prioritization of ego over the well-being of all might show up in different parts of the organization. So for example, you could have in a culture where there's a prioritization of the protection of ego is how we respond to fear. My role gives me status and power and acceptance, and I can't get out of line. Or no matter my status, my perspectives and ideas are of value. As long as I look like I'm following the process and procedure, I won't be dinged. But if I follow them to the letter, I can't get my work done. Versus, I know the process is designed to be safe and effective, but if it isn't working, or if conditions change, I need to bring it up and discuss changes. So some of the things that you guys have already been saying in your understanding, or I don't want to be seen as a complainer, so I figure out things on my own, or if I have any concerns about safety and risk, new hazards or weak controls, I need to communicate it. I have to make my numbers no matter what. And if I want to move up in my job, or we are tracking things to continuously improve, we have a different view of metrics. So it's important to report accurately and completely. All right, so my question to you is, which side do you think is going to be more helpful? The prioritization of the protection of ego or the prioritization of the well-being of all? Which side do you want? Right, the well-being of all. Like we all get that. I've talked to a lot of people. I've worked in areas where there's a lot of people with a military background. Of course, in the nuclear industry, we have a lot of Navy nukes. And everyone has said, the organizations that I've worked in, the teams that I've worked in that have really been successful have been the ones where we have really believed that we are our brother's keeper, that we're prioritizing the well-being of all. Now, this sounds like kumbaya and flowers and all of that thing. And it can be sort of frustrating to think about, well, how do I get there? How do I get there? And the truth is that in my examples, I've actually shown you 4 tools that you have within your control as a leader, as a safety leader, anybody who is shaping the work of others. You shape the work of others through roles, processes and procedures, communication, and measurement. Those are kind of the tools that everybody has. Linda Hill identified this in her work on, what does management really mean? And so when we shape those, when we look at those, then we can really identify, okay, am I in these roles? Am I driving towards the preservation of self and ego? Or am I encouraging, am I creating meaning around the well-being of all? So we'll talk about punishment in a moment. So in roles, what people are thinking, this is how they make meaning for themselves. In their role, what they're thinking is, what identities can I safely have? If I have this particular role, am I able to step outside of this role and, address people in different ways, have different points of view? What creates status and power in the organization? Is the status and power, is information power, and therefore I'm incentivized to hoard it, for example? And then, how do I contribute? Is my role important? And so how do I contribute within my role, and how am I being encouraged to contribute within my role? So think about a role as, what's meaningful for every individual's sense of self, which we all have to have, and can I shape that role in a way where the well-being of all is much more meaningful than a preservation of self? The way I talk about that role, the way I write that role, the way we discuss roles in a pre-job briefing, for example, how can I keep driving towards the well-being of all? And processes and procedures, think about, people are thinking, all right, what can I do and what can't I do? Is this process and procedure keeping me from being able to be adaptive or resilient? And where can I be and where can't I be? And, how do we achieve a shared sense of purpose in our processes and our procedures? A lot of us have worked in organizations. I've worked in organizations where, of course, not following the procedure is something that we get punished on. But at the same time, if you follow the procedure, you can't actually get your work done. I always thought it was crazy because I did not come from a safety background before I became the training manager for the nuclear facilities at Los Alamos. I came from the software industry. And so it was crazy to me that we would put a bunch of SMEs in a room and basically they would fight it out until they picked one way to do things right. And then after we picked the one way to do things right, we built the hazard controls around that one way. And that didn't make any sense to me. If there were a bunch of SMEs that had different views on it, why weren't we incorporating all of these different ways that things might get done? Because it's probably a good idea to know the variety that might happen within a particular process and procedure. But it kind of got driven out of the way that we did investigations, right? One of the ways that in an investigation, we were looking for sort of the thing to fix. We were looking for that root cause. And wow, if there was deviation from procedure, it was a godsend for the investigator, because then we could say, well, it was human error. And, here you go, Martha, here's your corrective action. Retrain this person with 25 years of experience doing this procedure on how to do the procedure. So this is, this can be thinking about all of the ways that meaning is conveyed within our processes and procedures, how meaning is conveyed in communication, who can interact with who, when, how, and when do we communicate, what might be the best way to drive that well-being of all. In measurement, this is important. As was brought up earlier, how do we define success? What do we monitor? What do we reward and punish? And how will we drive decisions? Lots of people talk about this, and because this can be so difficult within high hazard environments, but really, if we look at measurement as a way of rewarding and punishing people, then we can drive people into that preservation of self. If we look at what we measure as a way of understanding what we need to learn and change to be able to drive better decision-making along the way, that's a very different frame where people really see that they need to take that interpersonal risk of speaking up when things aren't going right. So I just want you guys to think for a moment about where your pluses and deltas might be in your roles, procedures, communication, and measurement. Where are you doing a great job in crafting roles that drive the well-being of all? And what are some of the things that you might need to change that might be creating the kind of fear that drives us towards the preservation of self? What around how you shape and talk about and create procedures you might want to preserve, and what you might want to change? That, I think, is a really important activity for us as safety leaders to start thinking about. It gives us 4 key levers, and it gives us a goal. How do we drive the meaning that we want is the well-being of others? We don't need to get too much in the weeds yet, but that sort of gives us a shared safety purpose, a shared safety message that we can take to all of the different ways that we, organize and control and frame work and the meaning of work. So I just want to check in with all of you. What one area, role, procedure, communication, measurement is your biggest delta? And which one is your biggest plus? So you can just type in like plus, roles, delta, communication, or anything like that. I just want to check in to see if this is meaningful to you. Okay, so Katrina, okay, minus communication, delta procedures, right? Good. Yeah, procedures. All right, excellent. So good. I'm glad that a few of you sort of can see, if you can immediately see where you might need to focus on, then I think you get this. And I hope that this is, in a sense, it's not easy, but in a way, it's a simple tool that helps you understand where to focus on instead of, what happened to poor Vice Admiral Nanos is becoming so frustrated that in an organization that was out of control, going back to that bad apple theory and thinking, well, if I just fire all the bad apples, then everything will be okay. And we know that doesn't work. But really trying to think about what are my building blocks here? All right, so I'm going to go to our next area, which is blame fixes nothing. And the reason why this is in a talk about context is because blame, of course, creates a context of fear. And blame is incompatible with safety. James Reason said it, Amy Edmondson says it, Todd says it, I say it. It's just the way it is. Blame is incompatible with safety. The safety cycle involves what you all were just saying. You have to recognize our fallibility. We have to ask questions. We need to seek help. That drives curiosity about problems so that we want to learn from unexpected outcomes, openly share ideas, and through that open sharing of ideas, we get better decision making, we get better innovation, we have better learning agility, and we have better accountability. Because accountability means, part of that means speaking up, talking about what you did and what you didn't do, and stepping up to say, this is what happened, and this is where I need help, or this is what I think needs to change, or this is what I don't understand. Right? That really is when we want people to be accountable, we want them to feel like they can talk about what happened and that they can become responsible for doing what they have committed to doing. Blame cycle just basically destroys all of that. If you have fear, you're not going to speak up. You're going to avoid recrimination. And you're going to have a lot less information. You're going to reinforce all kinds of biases, and you're in big trouble. So we really need to think about how we can drive blame out of our organizations. But the one way not to do it is to blame yourself for blaming. Blame is a natural human response to a threat to our egos. It is a natural human response to fear and the kind of insecurity that gets driven by fear. It's not really a blame cycle, it's a blame spiral. And unless we can actually become aware of our own blame tendencies and talk about our blame narratives, we are not getting out of the blame spiral. So we're going to ask, I'm going to ask you one more thing. Do we have a question there? or just a random unmuting?
I think it was a random unmuting.
Okay, sounds good. Feel free, at any point. I'm doing my best to monitor the chat, but do interrupt me. And you know what? You could totally disagree with me too. I tell people all the time that disagreement is my love language, and I said it in a team the other day that it was all men, and so I said, yeah, disagreement, arguing is my love language, and one of the guys came up afterwards and said, I'm a little confused, Dr. Acosta. My wife and I have been working on our love languages, and I don't remember disagreement being one of them in there. And I'm like, it's not, it was a joke. But so please feel free to disagree. All right, so I'm going to give you another quiz. And what I want you to pay attention to now is, if this is true of you, I not only want you to remember that it's true, but I also want you to remember the colors of the one that's true. This might be a bit of a cognitive test, but let's go. I often worry that people are being careless or irresponsible. So if this is true of you, you might want to write down P for purple on a sheet of paper. Okay. I would rather not hear about problems, mistakes, or bad news. So if this is true of you, you can write down a G for green. I sometimes accept blame that I don't deserve in order to protect my team and preserve relationships. If that's true of you, then you might want to write down O for orange. When someone gives me advice, I sometimes hear it as criticism of my abilities and decisions. If it's true of you, you might want to write down P for purple. I try to cultivate friendly relationships with superiors, regulators, and others in authority so that they will give me the benefit of the doubt if something goes wrong. Just give you a moment. It's a long statement. And then write down G if that's true of you. I'm sometimes so concerned about failure that I get stuck in analysis paralysis. So if it's true of you, write down orange. Now, the theory is, I didn't make this up. This comes from research around people's ego defenses. But what the research shows is that we all fall into one of these three categories. And the actual instrument where you measure this is a whole lot longer than the one that I gave you. But if you wrote down, a bunch of, you tended to write down the P, purple, then your blame narrative is to blame others. So you're in a stressful situation, you're like Pete Nanos, and you're just like, why can't these idiots get it right? And it's more, you're blaming others. That is just a natural ego defense. It's a normal thing. That doesn't mean you're a bad person. It's just what arises in us as a protective measure is that it's other people's fault. If you tended to write down green, then you tend to avoid blame. So blame is something that is dangerous and you don't even want to get in there. So if you're in a fearful situation, what you want to do is you avoid blame. So your blame narratives are all about, how maybe you're being blamed unjustly, or how other people just, don't get it. And then if you blame yourself, and this has been interesting because I've done this with a few groups, this is rare, and it's only rare in the safety field because a lot of times I'm speaking to a room of 50 people and then 2 of them are women, and the women are the ones who blame themselves. That's a whole, who knows what the cultural aspect of that is. But if you tend to blame yourself, then you're your ego defense is around taking on other people's pain, right? And blaming yourself. You preserve your ego by somehow being the caretaker or the hero of others. And so you blame yourself if you're in a situation that you think is blameworthy.
Hey,
Now,
Martha.
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry to interrupt, but there's a question in the chat around, and I'm going to paraphrase here,
Sure.
around percentage that fall into the different blame buckets or demographics associated with that.
So all I could look at, there probably is some research on that, and I don't know. I do think that the blame others might be the largest tendency. And I was curious about the blame yourself, because that's where I go. And then it seemed like nobody was like that until I walked into a room where there were actually other women doing this. And we found that we tended to blame ourselves. So I don't have data on who falls into which buckets, but it's probably out there and I might be able to find it. Yeah, but we do, I mean, we should fall into one of these buckets. And the thing is, what's interesting is if we fall into these buckets, we want to identify what some of our blame narratives are. So let's say if you fall into the buckets of blaming others, an exercise that you might do is think of a situation, maybe even think of something that is you can do this for all of these. Think of something that's a pet peeve, right? Something that really annoys you. You tend to react out of proportion when somebody does this. You know, maybe they show up to meetings, or their workspace is messy, or something like that. A situation like that that tends to really grab you emotionally. And then think about what narratives might come up. So if you think, let's say you're in one of the more of a blame others bucket, and a messy workspace really pisses you off. And so you stop and think, all right, I'm annoyed right now in seeing this person's messy workspace. What accusations do I have of a person who has a messy workspace? They are inconsiderate, they're they're careless, right? So you allow yourself to be as judgmental as you want to be. You're just doing it in your head. So, don't worry about it. It's happening unconsciously anyway. What you want to do is you want to bring it to consciousness to observe it. And so you start thinking about your blame narratives. Careless people are the ones who create the problems in this organization. So you come up with a narrative, a judgment there. When you bring up that judgment, then you can question it. Is that true? I mean, could I actually, if I looked objectively at all of the things, the incidents that we might have in the organization, is it true that the people who are doing them are the careless people? What if the opposite were true? What if the most experienced, the most careful people were the ones who were driving all of the incidents? What would that mean? Somehow, by turning it around, making the opposite of that judgment, of that narrative in your head, and seeing if in what context might the opposite be true, helps you let go of this conviction that your blame narrative is true. And then it's an attribution error, absolutely, Brad. When I think this blame narrative, careless people, they create all the incidents. When I think this, how do I behave? How do I treat others? How do I feel about myself? So think about times when that was your driving narrative in dealing with someone. How did it work out? Did it work out? It could work. Not necessarily that it's going to work out badly, but just think about that. How does it work out? Does thinking this way align with my values, and does it contribute to the well-being of all? Maybe thinking that I can get rid of all of the careless people somehow, will that really contribute to the well-being of all? Or will that actually drive fear in the organization and drive them to protect themselves? And then without this thought, what am I like? If I'm not walking around angry at all the careless people, how do I behave? How do I treat others? How do I feel about myself? So The way leaders, and I'm going to get into this, the way leaders respond to mistakes, to unexpected outcomes, to problems, unexpected behaviors in the organization really matters. And the only way you can manage your response authentically is by actually paying attention to your blame narratives and your biases. We call those limited thinking patterns, and start to question them. You have to do internal work to be a leader. You have to work on yourself and your own mind and your own attitudes to be a leader, because being a leader means managing the meaning for everyone and learning to create some empathy, because it is empathy that drives high performance in difficult situations. So I don't know if you believe me or not on that one, but I will get there. Yeah, self-reflection is really important. Yeah, looking inwards helps you take accountability for yourself, right? How can you ask other people to be vulnerable and ask for help if you can't demonstrate vulnerability? And the only way to demonstrate authentic vulnerability, and believe me, people know when you're being inauthentically vulnerable, is to actually, do that work on yourself so you can courageously lead. What courageous leadership really means, if you think about it from a Brené Brown perspective, courageous leadership actually means not bluff and bravado. It means allowing yourself to be vulnerable, taking those interpersonal risks that ultimately you need others to be able to take. You have to model that. And it's not modeling behavior, it's actually modeling your own authentic internal attitudes. Yeah, introspection. Absolutely. All right. So the last principle that I want to dive into from this psychological perspective is that leaders' response matters. So when we were rolling out essentially INPO's human performance program with some tweaks at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And Shane Bush had already done this work in Idaho. And so we were taking some of what he had done and all of that. So it's not like we were rolling out something brand new and touchy-feely and we were sort of these radical hippies from Santa Fe. We got that pushback that we were radical hippies from Santa Fe. And, that somehow by talking about reasons blame cycle, every idiot gets a pass, people can be as careless as they want to be. Everybody's blame narratives, and it was long before I understood this, I knew this research, everyone's blame narratives were just rising up around us. But the truth is this, we get the same thing with psychological safety. Psychological safety isn't terribly well understood. One thing that we do know from Google's Aristotle project that you've probably heard of is that when Google looked at 250 teams and, hundreds more different attributes of teams and just basically crunched the data, they found that psychological safety was the most important attribute of high-performing teams. That is, teams that work under high performance stress, right? So if we just give people a lot of performance stress, we have them working in high hazard operations with lots of things to remember and controls and complicated procedures, but we don't give them any empathy, we're just going to end up with a lot of anxious people, a lot of fear. And of course, that's going to drive that preservation of ego. If we don't give them any performance stress and we don't give them any empathy, then they're just going to be apathetic and people are just going to wander off, right? And this is what a lot of people are experiencing in other organizations that I work in I work in a lot in financial institutions. I work a lot in the high tech industry still. And, there's been sort of this, there's a lot of apathy that people are dealing with. If you just give people, empathy and you don't push them, then you're just going to get helplessness. People are going to just wait for the leader to tell them what to do, and they're not building any resilience in your organization. You're not building agility. You're not building creativity for them to be able to adapt and change to emerging situations. So you really do want to push people hard. And to do that, you need to be able to give them empathy. So what do I mean by empathy? It's not the whole, let's have a hug in our pre-job brief. That's not what I mean. Although I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. It kind of depends on your culture. But what it is cognitive empathy. So Daniel Goleman breaks empathy down into three things. There's our cognitive empathy, which we all know is sort of taking a walk in somebody else's shoes. It's being able to understand another person's perspective. And that, in order to do that, you need to be curious. So think, Edgar Schein and, humble inquiry, where you're actually really curious about how does the new guy who's showing up in this operation feel? Well, what do they think? What are they seeing in this operation that I think is a well-oiled machine, but that confuses the heck out of them, right? Really asking questions and being curious about that different perspective than what you are used to. And so, cognitive empathy is what we need for innovation. We need it for problem solving. We need it for being able to make an argument. If you want to convince somebody of something, you better convince them from their point of view rather than from your point of view. So you need to really understand what their resistance is and make sure that your argument addresses their questions and concerns. It's also really important for setting strategy. You can't set strategy at a high level of an organization without having an understanding of an external perspective that's coming in. What your partners might be thinking, thinking about things from your competitor's point of view, thinking about things from your customer's point of view. Emotional empathy is around vulnerability, and it's the ability to feel what other people feel. And this is practically important too. You need this for creativity. You need this to be able to motivate people, because people aren't motivated by external carrots, maybe for a short period of time, but that's always going to create an environment where people are focusing on their preservation of self. People are motivated by what's meaningful for them, by being part of a shared purpose, by feeling a strong sense of belonging and purpose within the organization. So if you can't be vulnerable in a way that someone will actually open up to you about how they feel, you can't resolve conflicts. You can't really even, product development, this design thinking process that was pioneered by IDEO and that has become a part of a lot of our organizations. Empathy is one of the stages in the IDEO process, and it is this emotional empathy where we really start to try and see who's going to use this and how do they feel. It's also really important in change management. That's sort of where the humble part of Ed Schein's humble inquiry comes from. He started his career focusing on change management. And then the final one is empathetic concern. And this, I think, is one of the things that is most important towards being able to drive high performance standards, push people into that psychological safety zone, where psychological safety is really important, and creating that psychological safety is being able to understand what people need from you. And that's, of course, having compassion for them, but really thinking about what their needs are. And that's, I think, a fundamental part of leadership. Leadership means that you understand what your team needs from you in order for them to do incredible, amazing things in crazy environments for you. So in order to develop people, in order to engage in crisis management, in order to engage in change management, you really need to bring your compassion to the table in order to understand people's needs. So this is a model that I kind of came up with in listening to everybody. You know, I came back into the safety world probably a few years ago. I had my head deep in working with Harvard and working on leadership issues, and hadn't, you know, thought about my time at Los Alamos so much, except in moments of trauma, thinking about how traumatic that experience was. But I started thinking about how, you know, the way that Todd talks about capacity and other people talk about capacity, and realized that we needed to break it out. And what I saw was that, well, there's one activity in building organizational capacity where we identify the strategic pressures and the systemic weaknesses in our organization, and we see how that might be impacting safety. We have that more of that systems view that many people talk about, being able to take that systems view of the organization and identify how the organization and organizational systems might be driving the behaviors that we don't want, and how we can have them drive the behaviors that we do want. And if you saw, and I recommend that you do watch the documentary on Netflix on the 737 MAX Boeing airplane. And in that documentary, you see how there are some crazy organizational pressures, which are strategic pressures. Boeing trying to compete, and how they're competing, and how they look at competition, and how they look at what, you know, from a business school perspective would be their scorecard, their strategic scorecard, and trying to manage that. I saw that in working in the IT industry too, where you're managing the stock price, which means that you're focusing on your gross margins, and you see that an easy way to change your financials so that you get a different score on the street is firing everybody and then hiring them back as contractors. That is one way. I mean, quality is part of your gross margin, but that's hard to change. But I can certainly change my gross margin by firing everyone and hiring them back as contractors. And I saw that happening within Cisco systems, and I don't feel like I'm speaking out of line because it was pretty much public. And it was insanity. It created a situation where me, who was basically training leaders and training managers of just an impossible situation that these managers were trying to deal with. But it was because of the organizational pressure to maintain a certain stock price, right? So us being able to build capacity into those organizational systems where we are constantly working on other factors in your gross margin, like quality and, you know, minimal defects and things like that, rather than at the last minute trying to do some crazy quick fix in order to be able, you know, to keep your stock price at a certain price. That's where you build capacity at an organizational level. At an operational level, it's what safety professionals do all the time, is, you know, identifying hazards, creating barriers and controls and against those hazards, looking for those error-prone situations, and constantly managing that and creating that capacity within your operations for people to make mistakes, for unexpected outcomes to happen, and for those unexpected outcomes not to hurt somebody or kill somebody or destroy the environment or all of those things. So though that work is creating that buffer, right? That capacity. Psychological capacity is necessary for both of those things. How do we create the culture, the mindsets to promote the kind of openness, curiosity, and creativity that is going to allow us to see weaknesses in our organizational systems and actually be able to change them? Allow us to think strategically enough to look into the future and see what behaviors, what operations we need now to build that capacity to respond to different strategic pressures. And likewise, in the operational, how are we going to see emerging hazards and changes in our environment so that we can respond to those? How we do that, one of those things is creating psychological safety, but there's other ways, through our leadership practices, through how we, develop people, how we create purpose that's important. So if we build that psychological capacity as well as our organizational operational capacity for safety, then what we want expectations and conflicts around safety and failure to be openly and honestly discussed. We can't have at the C-suite level, because of their fear of their stock price or their competitive environment, for them not to be able to talk about safety and failure, for them to create a barrier to being able to do that, so that creates a barrier to change. Leaders and workers need to admit and recognize their own fallibility, because human beings, are fallible. And what we're doing is we are doing great things with fallible tools. And that's why we need to, look for error-prone situations, do hazard identification. Unexpected outcomes, what we often call failure, are discussed and learned from. And it's not just building your lessons learned program. We had that in the DOE. We had a whole database full of lessons learned, and they weren't lessons learned. They were lessons that we should have learned. And we need to get past just identifying lessons that we should have learned to actually creating learning on the job. Difference and diversity drive problem solving, recognizing that different points of view need to be embraced. You might not act on them. It's not a power struggle of who's right. We have to let go of the importance of being right and emphasize the importance of learning. And then latent weaknesses and emergent hazards are addressed with curiosity, not fear and blame. Curiosity and humbleness. I hear this over and over again from Ranjay Gulati and other professors at Harvard who speak to my classes, that curiosity and humbleness are very important. It's not me or you, but us. Absolutely, Ashley. So we have, oh, wow. I was actually looking at the wrong clock. We have plenty of time for questions and conversation on this. I have that we've been on for an hour and 14 minutes, and I wanted to save 15 minutes for sort of Q&A and discussion. But then I look at my other clock and I see that we still have another 25 minutes. So we have lots of time. So Dean, I'm going to sort of hand it over to you to start a little Q&A.
Perfect. And I'll invite all of you, please, feel free to raise your hand or chat into the chat box or unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment, but I'm going to start off. So Martha, thank you for all of those insights. And then I'm listening and I'm doing a whole bunch of reflection on my own behaviors and attitudes and the way I process stuff. And it occurs to me that here's my hypothesis. This is all predicated on a high level of emotional intelligence and self-awareness. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm super vulnerable and I'm very emotionally intelligent and I'm very self-aware, but that's a whole bunch of overconfidence bias. So we're likely. So how do what are the magic bullets to to really getting better at that? Is it, we had the chat in the chat box about, I think, to paraphrase, self-reflection all the time. Is it, waking up every morning and spending 20 minutes meditating and thinking about how do I want to show up today? What is it? Is there a magic bullet or set of magic bullets? I
There's
hate
a
the term
few,
bullets. I'm sorry.
yeah, there's a few practices that are I think really helpful for people sort of starting out. And one of them is really around emotional agility, right? So when I was talking about, identify things that trigger you and that you respond to emotionally over the top every day, whether you express that or not, triggers are really helpful in developing ourselves in our emotional intelligence, because they should drive us to mindfulness. They tend to drive us towards reacting without thinking about it. But the more we become aware of that trigger, so if you can just take a moment where someone really does something that's really annoying, and you would normally just run with that, this person is annoying, and act on that way. Instead of doing that, become aware of that emotion and just say it to yourself. I'm angry, or I'm annoyed, or I'm scared, or whatever it might be that arises in your body in the moment of that trigger. That right there creates a pause. And if you create a mindful pause, then that opens the whole world up to you, because then you have a choice as to how you react. So that's just a simple daily practice. I call it a daily practice of leadership. A daily practice of leadership is knowing how you feel. And that is simple, not always easy, as you mentioned, Dean. Another thing that, for some reason, I can't remember his name, but I can find his book on my bookshelf somewhere. There is a researcher from Harvard who's spoken to a lot of my classes, who does a lot of research on happiness. And he has mind-boggling research on gratitude and what gratitude does every day. So Dean, you kind of brought that up, like, would you wake up in the morning and meditate? One thing you can do is wake up in the morning and be grateful for something. And I would love to do, I am bugging some of my clients about doing an experiment on this in industry and seeing what it's like. But so how gratitude, what they find is that gratitude in and of itself has a disproportionate effect on people's well-being, their happiness, their ability to be creative, and their ability to be present in their work, right? But there's a catch. You can't, like, let's say you do the gratitude exercise that was going around on Facebook, and you wake up every morning and you think of 3 things to be grateful for. It doesn't work if you're grateful about the same 3 things. The thing that really does it is the scanning. So when you scan your environment for something unexpected that you are grateful for, or something that you hadn't really thought of before, and you do that every day and come up with something different, it starts to have a really positive impact on your brain and your thinking. And this is not what he says. I suspect, in looking into fear for a lot of my career, is that it starts to show you that you have a larger environment that you shouldn't fear. I think it starts to reduce your sense of fear. So the experiment that I want to do is, I want to get a team of people who are doing their pre-job briefs on a job all the time, and have one of those, or have a sample that spend a little time thinking about what they're grateful for that day, and some that don't. Add that into the pre-job brief and see if that has any impact on performance and safety.
That would
That's
be
my,
a really interesting experiment because I will
yeah,
bet it has a significantly positive impact.
yeah, yeah.
And we have, so there's a chat in the chat box I'll get to in a second, and Lauren Mooney has her hand up. So I'll go, Lauren, you first.
Hi, Lauren. You're muted at the moment.
Minor detail. Good morning, guys. So good to see you. Yeah, I just wanted to say, thank you. I loved, Martha, how you talked about the creating meaning. Like, really, we're sorting everything out. What does this mean? And I'm just thinking, if anyone hasn't read the Surgeon General's report on from last week, he's putting out a model of, how we need to change work around so that it can be healthier for those individuals. And in the beginning, he writes, this is a call to action to lift workers' voices.
Mhm.
So this morning, just what was hitting me is that, we have suppressed workers' voices throughout time.
Right.
So how are we going to get our hands around that leadership piece of, I want to suppress your voice? It does not come natural. So it's both directions. We're naturally afraid. And for some reason, this is doubly hard because the leaders, what's the meaning for them of this person speaking, So,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I absolutely do know what you're saying. And I mean, I think it comes down to those things that we talked about before around curiosity and compassion and vulnerability as leaders. But what Dean says, that's difficult. And I think one of the reasons why we've suppressed workers' voices is that we're trying to suppress complexity in our complex environments, in our hazardous environments. That's why we've created these error traps by having these very rigid procedures many times that actually aren't adaptable enough to emerging and changing conditions. One of the things that I have done some research on is cognitive complexity. And all cognitive complexity is being able to look at things from lots of different points of view. And I think that, leaders, we have this tension that, especially in sort of the medical field. My father was a neurosurgeon. And so I don't know if any of you have met neurosurgeons, but they really are as bad as their reputation. Is that when you become an expert, what you are focusing on narrow and narrower things, and you're getting positive feedback on having the right answer, right? And so you find that success comes from narrowing your view. But in leadership, success comes from broadening your view. A lot of times you become a leader in these high-tech fields because you are an expert. And yet, to be a leader, you have to do the opposite. You have to be able to broaden your view, look at things from lots of different perspectives, not immediately sort out what you think is wrong and what you think is right. I mean, researchers, I think, do have more of that broader perspective. So, if you have a really difficult diagnosis, I suggest seeing a specialist and also seeing a PhD MD rather than just an MD. But because they're curious about the outliers and they're curious about the differences. So we need to, part of it from an organizational standpoint to build that resiliency is how are we going to develop and incentivize our leaders for also exploring, for struggling, for being wrong. And what I see in the development programs of some of the organizations I work with, like Mars, I think is a very good organization for this. They deliberately drive a lot of their leaders to have a lot of lateral moves in their career rather than just climbing up the ladder. Right. So that lateral move and moving around and working in different regions and working in very different parts of the business create that sort of broader perspective that will help them be more curious about differences in their operations. So that's a couple of ideas.
Yeah. Thank you.
We have, so there's one chat in the chat box about, do you have an article or short video breaking down the graph with the apathy, psychological safety, anxiety, and helplessness components?
I do not, Katrina. I'll tell you exactly who I stole that from. And I'm not sure if I stole it from Michael Roberto, who's a professor at Bryant University. And he works with Amy Edmondson. And he showed that graph in a presentation he did to one of my cohorts. And then I saw that Amy Edmondson also used it too. And also, and then, you know, it kind of like became a very popular, it got changed. What I did was a mixture of Michael Roberto's and then how Robin Ely sort of changed it, because she's the one who added sort of the empathy and the compassion piece. I gave Dean a PDF of these slides and you can have them. And maybe I should actually create a short video on that. I don't know where Michael Roberto, I know the thinking behind it, but I don't know if he's citing anything, because on his slide, he didn't put a source. So I don't have a source.
I think that's really important to understand that dynamic, because a lot of times when people think we function in this, very quick, needing to be very adaptable environment, that the solution is to ease anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not, it's to improve psychological safety, because you may not be able to ease anxiety. So I really liked that a lot.
And I think you want that good anxiety, right?
Mm-hmm.
You want that good, that sort of, I'm comfortable being uncomfortable in this situation, and this anxiety is creating a heightened sense of awareness and a heightened scanning of the environment, which is good information for me doing a new or difficult thing. I think probably there's also some relationship to systems 1 and systems 2 thinking. Daniel, not Daniel Goleman, it's another G. Why can't I think of his name right now? But that book is about how we make decisions. There's the fast decision making, which is absolutely fantastic. We're using what we already know and applying it to the current situation, and it makes us super efficient, and that's great. But there's times when we want to be able to, that discomfort is what moves us into that space where we're paying more attention to the differences, and we're using multiple past experiences and models to create a new model, mind model, that will help us navigate this new situation. You don't want to put everybody in that situation all the time, but you want to build that flexibility in people.
Thank you.
Sure.
So let's pause here to see if we have any more questions, because we're sort of running out of runway.
Okay.
That's a pretty good metaphor. Ashley Robinson had a powerful thought, I think, in the chat box, just about how we pay attention to ourselves and how that translates to, Ashley, sorry, I'm going to paraphrase again, but translates to our own personal well-being, and then translates to well-being of others in our organization. So thank you very, very much for that.
Yeah, and Loretta and Ben and Jeff all were my brains. Thank you, and remembered it was Daniel Kahneman with Thinking Fast and Slow. There's a question here from Bob. How does one measure the effectiveness of any of these great initiatives they attempt in the field to ensure that it's working? Oh, I do want to answer that, not because I have an answer, but because I don't have an answer necessarily. Measuring effectiveness, and ROI is always been sort of what people are looking for in any kind of training and development and any kind of leadership development. And it's been around. And of course, we have our Kirkpatrick sort of 4 levels. But I think how you measure the effectiveness is ultimately, if you have a good idea of what you want to achieve, and safety is hard because it's kind of, you want to, you really, as Todd and lots of other people, Bob, always say, you have to look for those conditions for safety rather than just measuring when you don't have an incident. so that sort of regressive measurement of, we've brought down our SIF isn't as meaningful as measuring the conditions that create a safe environment. And so that often is around a lot of your larger performance measurements in the organization. So, one thing that I talk about with some of my colleagues who have a similar background, they're like, why do we distinguish safety so much from just general organizational improvement and performance? Because the things that we do to improve safety are also the things that we do for organizational performance and improvement. So safety is so fundamental. It's so fundamental to even strategic competitiveness for organizations that are working in high hazard industries. We really should be looking, is the organization performing the way that we want to perform? And then we will see if our performance measures aren't too narrow, then we'll see that things are working. And that is my kind of politician's answer. But I do know, and Bob, you can push back on me, but I do know that if we get too focused on singular particular measurements, they tend to bite us in the butt.
I'm not necessarily tying that to an ROI measurement, but like anything that we have to justify is to say, is the proof of all those positives that we're doing showing up to where, I'm not going to, I never understood why that shouldn't reduce the absence of the negatives.
Right.
Because if I'm doing more positives, I should be reducing the negatives.
Yeah.
We unfortunately, when we work in the plants, we always, no matter what the initiative is, we're budget constrained, and we're going to have to justify that whatever we're doing is having a positive impact. And I just haven't been able to grasp on how to measure that to leadership who may not be as progressive as the people who are trying to initiate it.
Yeah, and my approach has always been, don't make it an initiative, is make it, so if we're focusing on leadership and we're focusing on the well-being of the all and the well-being of the team, it's part of how we should be operating in general and be part of our ongoing. If we don't have leadership development in your organization, then that should scare people. And it's just how we do that leadership development. It's how we do the on-the-job training. It's how we do our pre-job and post-job briefs. It's not that you have to do anything new. You just have to do what you're already doing a little bit different. Really plussing the stuff that's supporting the well-being of all, and really thinking about where are the little tweaks that are going to happen, that we need to happen. Now, if you're in an organization that hasn't bought in yet to doing pre-job briefs and haven't bought into post-jobs and those building in some learning teams around on a regular basis and that sort of stuff, then you're having to sell some actual operations. But otherwise, what I'm talking about is how to make those more effective.
Yeah, it's a different discussion, but then also when you have your champions in place like that, and then you have a high turnover rate, then how often is it institutionalized before it goes out the door with whoever the sponsor or champion was? Right,
exactly. And that's why it's so important to be thinking about this in terms of what meaning are we building into the organization's macro culture and micro cultures and team dynamics, because even if the champion goes away and the people in those teams are feeling supported, it's not going to go away. I mean, I work with oil companies that have talked about some of the research that I've read about those drilling platforms, and they're saying, those changes that we made way back when have created a completely different environment on those drilling platforms. And although there's been organizational changes and problems and stuff, once people feel like they belong and they're taking care of each other and they're happy, they're not going to let go of any of that,
No matter where they go.
no matter where they go. Yeah,
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the excellent presentation as well.
sure.
And one more quick question, and then some appreciation and next steps. Are there any training programs that you or other experts in this field provide on this subject?
Yeah, so I've been rolling out with some of my clients a 4-day workshop on psychological safety. And I'm a learning and development person for 25 years, so I'm a big believer in tools. So we kind of go through tools and that sort of stuff. So it's very hands-on. Amy Edmondson contracted with a training company that I don't remember, that teaches from her book, The Fearless Organization. And I'm not familiar with that. It's not focused on safety people. I focus on safety people. But yeah, I mean, you can talk to me, you can look there. Psychological safety has become sort of a big deal, and you will find people who will teach on it. I cannot, I'm pretty sure Amy Edmondson knows what she's talking about, although she doesn't deliver that training herself. She licensed it to a company that delivers it. But you know, as with everything, you want to make sure that there are people who know what they're talking about when it's trendy. You know.
Martha, thank you very, very much for everything today. And if it's okay with you, and I think it is, but I'll just double check that you did send on a PDF copy of your slides. What I'll do is we'll send that out to everybody who registered and was part of the discussion today. And everybody who joined, thank you very much for taking the time and putting the energy into this discussion today. And a quick highlight: on November 16th at 11 a.m., Charlie Garland will be presenting, and Charlie will add some additional perspectives to this topic about recognizing our own, cognitive behaviors and how we move past that. So I think it's a really good build. But more than anything, Martha, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all, everybody.
All right, take care, everybody. Have a great day.